Hello, and welcome to Leadership in Challenging Times on the NorQuest College podcast. Hosted by Dr. Jody Abbott, President and CEO of NorQuest College, and Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson, 3rd Canadian Division Headquarters with the Canadian Army, this podcast will discuss challenging and difficult topics affecting community, business, and soldiers alike. The presenters may at times express their personal opinion or take a contrary position to expand the conversation, ranging from leadership to sensitive subjects to current affairs. The podcast will tackle issues in an open manner with an eye on identifying and expanding ideas from all sides of the discussion. Jody and Jeff will now start the podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Leadership in Challenging Times. This is episode number 15. We are very pleased today to be here with Andrea Mondor from Bolt. Bolt, what a great name. Andrea, can you tell us what you do and who you are?
Oh, thanks so much, Jody. First of all, born and bred Albertan entrepreneur. So dirt under my fingernails, bruises on the elbows to build up an organization in a great province. Bolt Transition is focused exclusively on executive and board transition. So what does that mean? We help organizations with the movement of people within roles and also with the design of organizations as well and the change that happens as part of that.
Oh, wow, that's neat. I didn't know such a job existed.
So do they have this kind of role in the reserves or the Canadian Armed Forces?
No, we don't have somebody that helps us with that. We tend to sort of flow through it and make the mistakes, but we tend to when we get big structural organizations, as with any government organization, we tend to do it 3 or 4 times before we try to get it right, and sort of go through it. So I'm really interested. So how do you approach a problem? Like, what's your first step that you do? So you show up here at the college, like, how do you approach the problem? Because I find that fascinating. How would you get to that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, for me, actually, it starts with that walk up the street and really understanding the people that come here and the people that lead this great place. I have to tell you that I'm often moved while I walk in the building and see the joy and the energy and the excitement that's in the students and the staff that work here. And it starts there. It starts understanding the heartbeat and the energy and the purpose that fuels an organization. And we take it from there.
Wow. So do you look at, like, I find this fascinating. So do you look at the terms of reference for the people and then try to find, like how do you approach the problem, like the actual institutional problem? Do you look at it on an institutional level, or do you look at it from, like the people in the institution?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's multifaceted. So no one route through, but many, many, many lenses. But ultimately, when we look at a leadership transition or an organizational transformation, we begin with the strategy. And so what's terrific at NorQuest is there is a brilliant, bold, and beautiful strategy that's well articulated called Imagine 2025. And that is our beacon for what you want to accomplish. And it's in the language, and it's in the objectives, and it's in the pictures and the words that have been built into that strategy. So we take our cues very strongly from that.
So you look at the end state, what you want to achieve, and then start working backwards from that. In the Army, we call that the end state, like what you want to get to, right? That's what you're doing. So that's the Vision 2025, which I'm very familiar with. We did have a podcast number 1, talked about that. Going through those line by lines and seeing how institutionally you get to those, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, and it's so critical to look at it from an organic and iterative process, never to assume that there's one line of sight or one right answer, but it's that continually working through questions and information and people's perspectives to build up that deep understanding of where the organization is and where it wants to go.
Wow.
So one of the things that might be helpful, Andrea, and certainly to our NorQuest listeners, is to use our organizational redesign as an example. So as you know, Jeff, we have Imagine 2025, and hopefully many of our employees know about Imagine 2025. And what happened is our Strategic Management Committee, which is one of the committees that was to build the roadmap to move forward the strategy, said, you know, this is really interesting. We have this big, bold, courageous strategy. And are we organized in a way that's going to actually help us to achieve the strategy? Do we have all the right skill sets? Do we have the right mix of people? Do we have all the values in place? And is our purpose clear on where we want to go? And so in that, we said, okay, we can look at organizational design on our own. But part of what NorQuest is trying to do is say that by 2025, 80% of what we do, how we do it, will be different. So our challenge of us doing this kind of redesign transformation on our own is we bring our baggage and our own perspective to the table. So we went out to find an organization that would help us really tip us on our head, really, in terms of our thinking. And so that's where Bolt came in. And Andrea, maybe you can just talk about what did that engagement look like? Because I think through the walking through the steps we went through, I think it'll be very interesting to say, okay, so if you were going through something like this in the Canadian Forces, how would your process be different? Because I think we will likely see some differences there.
Yeah, for sure.
How long ago did this start? Like, when did you make that decision, Jody, to bring somebody in?
So I think our engagement started in about October, was
so
the initial.
6
so
months ago,
it's, it takes time
that.
and many, many, many conversations.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Sorry, I mean, to train your thought, I was just like when did this come in with the plan? So that's cool.
Yeah, so absolutely multifaceted approach. We begin with deep roots in academic and practice literature to make sure that we understand what other organizations and researchers are saying about, agile organizations and what it takes to connect that structural capacity and ingenuity that's inside organizations towards executing on the strategy. We looked at comparable post-secondary institutions and what their structure looked like in their context. We looked at post-secondary institutions that aren't comparable but have interesting things that they're doing that we could learn from. We looked at non-post-secondary institutions that have something really important to provide as learnings to NorQuest around change and agility and transformation. We looked at a number of different leadership scenarios within those post-secondary institutions, talking to people like boots on the ground and experiences to understand, what did it really take to achieve the transformations that they were after. We spoke to leaders at NorQuest to really mine their experiences, because this isn't, to use a very common phrase in Alberta, this isn't your first rodeo. And have truly, another wave of transformation. You're good at this. You've done some great things already. And how does that cascade or connect into this next wave of transformation? So lots more steps from there, but perhaps that's enough for us to keep asking questions.
So just in terms of the process, so you identified the sort of the problem set. You did some analysis, market analysis on what's out there and what's comparative and what's best practices in industry, and as you said, outside of industry, someone that does something unique that they to solve problems. Is that where you're at right now? You're at that point where you've sort of got best practices and you're developing a model. Is that where you're at right now?
I would say we've gone further than that. So what we did is we looked at what people are doing out there, and we said, we want a bit of this. We don't want to be that. And we've decided as an institution, we want to be a disruptive institution, meaning we don't want to follow, we want to lead, and we want a little bit of surprise in that people are going to go like, what are you guys doing over there? Well, we want that. We want people to say, what are you doing over there? So from that work, we basically sat and said, okay, if this is what we want to achieve in the strategic plan, what are the overall functions and skill sets that we need in the organization to get there? And honestly, the people in current positions were kind of, that was the last step in where we went, because it really was about what functions do we need and skill sets to get to achieve our strategic plan, to truly be disruptive. And then we looked at the current structure. So we looked at a new structure first and said, what does this look like? And I can tell you, we went through iteration over iteration over iteration. And I think at the end of the day, I personally believe any structure in an organization can work as long as you've thought about all of the right things. But I also think we landed on there are certain things that will work better than others. And it was because we had some core principles that we were following. So we've actually gone through the entire process. We now have announced a new executive structure, a new organizational structure, and it's disruptive. It's really quite disruptive because it's going to require that we work differently because of the structure that we've put in place.
Well, I remember the podcast number 1, we talked about the new policy, and one of the questions was, how do they take an idea? So someone sees a business development opportunity. How do we take that idea and get it so that we can teach a program or do something in a timely manner before you're overcome by the marketplace? And I remember that was a real problem that you said, we don't have that answer yet. So I'm assuming that this is one of the solutions, like how does the college keep up with the market trends or the desires for certain courses and training?
Yeah, very thoughtful observation there, that the organizational structure must free that up to organize, self-organize, and solve those problems, both to, feed forward solutions, but also to work on, existing processes and programs and things that you do, super well to deepen that excellence and take those learnings and keep working on it, so that it's that, that engine of entrepreneurship. It's the engine of co-creation and innovation that needs to be, released in the organization. And sometimes structures can stand in the way of that. And what we're after here at NorQuest is that structure that releases the talent and the ingenuity that's here.
Yeah, allows people to operate and bring their creativity to it. Because that was one on the floor when we opened it up to the floor. That was the two people asked those questions. That was, hey, I got this idea. How do I get this so we can do something about it? And they felt the institutional structure stymied their ability to get that that message out, or to get that up to the right people to respond to it. So that's exciting.
It's interesting as we were going through the process, and Andrea has a particular slide where it talks about stability and agility. I might not have exactly the right words, but there's this, I think the box was orange in the middle, which is, it's NorQuest orange, so that's perfect. But it was this tension in the middle. And it's always interesting because if you talk to Jill Matthew, who has just now moved into a new role, but formerly the CFO, she would say, we have to make sure that we have really strong finance processes, because we want to make sure that our accounting is good and we can account for our money, and we have to have good stewardship. At the same time, when people are trying to be creative and do things, they're like, yeah, but those processes are getting in the way. And so you will have that natural tension in the middle. But how do you shift process that allows you to have, and I think, Andrea, these are your words, predictability and stability, because people need to know, well, I need to do this and I can't do this, at the same time as creating an environment that can be agile to respond to the entrepreneurial opportunities that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I find this super fascinating because in the Army right now, in the Army Reserve, we're going through a period where we've introduced new capabilities within the Army Reserve. So we have people doing light urban search and rescue. We've got people who are doing very specific Army jobs that traditionally we didn't have before that we've brought back. And we're trying to figure out just that the word predictability. That's what jumped out at me, which we have to make it predictable for the students, the soldiers. But at the same time, you still have to deliver what you have to do. So that's really interesting how you working around that problem of, you have to have institutional stability. But I think what we're saying, we got from a college point of view, got to get rid of that institutional inertia that's not allowing the system to adapt to the changing marketplace and environment. And that's our problem in a large institution like the Armed Forces, is that institutional inertia. Because you imagine, we got the college here, but I got like full-time and part-time people, and then we got geographical, and there's all this other stuff. And we struggle with that institutional inertia where the desire for change might be there, but the institution is just not allowing you to do it in a timely manner. One of our problems is that we have to do 18 months out. We have to do our institutional planning for how we're going to spend our resources and our money. Well, it doesn't matter what you want to do. You got an 18-month gap before you can do anything, because our whole structure of how we pay and do our finances and everything else. So I find this really refreshing to hear that there's to sort of delve into that part of it. Because that would be a pretty deep dive in the Armed Forces level, I could tell you that, to sit down and look at our institutional barriers that really stop us from doing stuff. And some of it we can't control because it's government in Canada or stuff like that. But there's a whole bunch of stuff we can control. That's really neat.
Absolutely. And it's also mindset.
Yeah, very true. Very
often
true.
it's a getting comfortable with that things aren't perfect and maybe won't ever be perfect, but they're going to be great. And so being comfortable in a place where things are changing, comfortable with the idea of working on something and having changes that get incorporated over time. So that's a big part of redesign towards agility, is around that transformational mindset, as well as people kind of lifting up and saying, happy to get messy, happy to take these things on and discover where the opportunities are and to keep working at that.
Yeah, because I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for you, Jody, is going to be keeping everybody's expectation. And one of my big things I talk about is mission command, where if everybody understands the goal, the end state, what we're trying to get to, you can be fairly adaptive inside there, because it's not a rigid path to get there. It's a general path. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the future. But the good thing is, even I know the NorQuest plan for 2025. So if all the other members of the staff understand that, they know that's where we're going to. If you shimmy a little left or shimmy a little right, it doesn't really matter, because you're still on the path.
I think it's interesting. Jeff talks about mission command, and when I first met Jeff, it was at a session where he was talking about leadership in the Canadian Armed Forces, and mission command was the topic. And I had a perspective that if you're a soldier, you're told what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And that was, my very naive perspective of what is mission command, because I was like, okay, mission command is you're going to tell me what to do. I'm going to go do it, and we're going to have the best possible result. And what I learned from that talk is mission command is more about, here are the parameters of the box that you're going to play in. Figure out as a team how to get there. And is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah,
fair,
that's
Jeff?
exactly it. Yeah.
So I think it's kind of breaking down the initial thinking of what something is. And in some ways, it's not unlike what we're looking at NorQuest, because we're saying, here's where we want to go. And yes, there are going to be some things, some of our rules around the stability part of the organization, that we have to make sure that we tick these boxes in order to be a good steward of money, in order to be a good community citizen, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a whole lot of room to play. And I think there's two kinds of play. I think in the organization, it's how do we work within that box? And we are also asking people to press the sides of the box. Mm-hmm. And sometimes knock the lid off the box, because that's disruption. Playing inside is what we have to do. I think we want to know what parameters are we working on. But I think if we look at the industry of post-secondary, the people who will lead won't be working in the box anymore. There are certain people in the organization that have to, because of the roles that they have. So that's that stability piece. And I think we were just in the Netherlands on an educational mission, I would say. And, there was one example where my head was spinning when I heard this professor talking, and it was someone who was a professor in a university. He had created a whole new model, a whole new paradigm, and it was very interesting because we've got an initiative going in the organization around reimagining higher education. And so when we talk about reimagining higher education, what we're doing is we've got the box and we push it here and we say, oh, we're going to have modular-based learning, or we're going to do more online. That to me is still within the box of how we see post-secondary education. So when I look at what happens in the Netherlands in this particular case, it was so not that. It was, holy cow, we have to actually blow the lid off the box. And yes, there will still be the offerings that are in the box, but what's the opportunity in the market by knocking the lid off and thinking beyond that? Now, in the Canadian Armed Forces, how would a comment like that even land?
You know, it's actually quite really funny because first I need a definition of disruption. So it's not something we use. We use it a different way to mean different things. I think is the best way. We're disrupting somebody. It might be a little bit more kinetic than what we're talking about.
How would you define it?
Is that just like something that's a lot of change, or something that disrupts the normal sort of business practices because it's something completely different? Is that kind of it? Sort of.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, at the college, we don't see it as negative. We see it as we're going to reward people for disrupting, and it's really about thinking and shifting the paradigm of the way we've always thought so that we can fulfill the needs of our students and customers, so that we can lead the market, so that people would look at us and say, I can't believe what they're doing over there, and I want to be part of it, and I want to be a resource to it, and I want to donate because I can see how this institution is seeing something that is very future oriented that maybe we haven't paid enough attention to.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and just what's lovely there, and Jody, in your comment, is that disruption in the way that we're talking about it, of course, and thinking about it is it's very purposeful. It's not without purpose or positive direction. Sometimes those effects can, be difficult or challenges, but ultimately it is toward purpose. It is towards the strategy. It is towards building the NorQuest of the future.
So it's almost embracing change and doing everything else. It just do things differently, right? And really rewarding people for that. So talking about from the Armed Forces perspective, I actually had a conversation with my old regimental sergeant major because we were talking about higher education for senior leadership in the Army Reserve. And I said, so we send people to Ottawa to take an ethics course, a senior leadership ethics course. And I said, why couldn't he mentor 4 or 5 up and coming leaders as a job? That's what he does as his job as a when he's finished being the regimental sergeant major, and be a mentor and teach it that way rather than 15 slides in a book that you read. Why not have a mentoring program? Because who's the best? Did you learn the lesson of those ethics and morals and all that kind of stuff that are being projected about? Because we have very set ideals. Our ethos, our military ethos, our ethics and morals are very defined for us as a culture. And we want to make sure people are embracing them, understanding them, and they're pushing them down. And I thought, just because you attended a lecture does not necessarily mean you understand it. But if we had a process where you mentored somebody to get that lesson across, that to me was a better way of doing it. So are we actually going to do that? Probably not.
And would that have been considered disruptive?
Yeah, it probably would, because it would disrupt everybody's brain trying to figure out how we would do it. Because we have, and that's why I find this really exciting, because the ability to change, the ability to adapt, we have that as a requirement. Like in my yearly evaluation, I have, how do I deal with changing circumstances, and it's one of the criteria of my officer evaluation, and I always felt that when we looked at that when you first got it, and I was a supervisor, I kind of said, okay, for the guy below me or gal below me, it's how are you adapting to the change that I am imposing on you? And that's kind of what the rating was. And then later on, as I became a more senior, I realized, no, what that's talking about is we've got a new policy that kind of like disrupts things. And how are we adapting, and how are you dealing with that adaptive nature that has to be, you have to be like that all the time? Because I think as a trait, as a military officer, if you're very rigid and compartmentalized and you have no flexibility today in the environment, you're simply not going to be able to adapt to the changes, because things happen different ways now than they did, say, 100 years ago for what the military does. So I just find this super fascinating to see the parallels. But unfortunately, our institutional structures just aren't. Well, no, I won't say that. I don't think that's fair, because we have been adaptive. We have changed rapidly institutionally to deal with, say, Afghanistan. We've done a good job with that. But it tends to be, there has to be an overpowering need. I think this is visionary, and I think what Jody and the team are doing is envisioning something and changing it before there's an overpowering requirement. Hey, if you don't change in 18 months, you're going to go out of business, right? That's a different type of adaptive model to, we want to get out in front of the problem because we recognize we need to be adaptive to be successful in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, Jeff, because in the way you've just described it, I would say for NorQuest, it's both. Because,
really?
Yeah, because first of all, the burning platform is that, in my view, if post-secondary institutions don't change, we will die. So if we don't get ahead of the curve, if we don't look at alternative revenues, if we don't look at students as customers, because a student can go anywhere, they all pay tuition. Yes, government supports that, but people can select where they go. And so I think it's both. It's about getting ahead of it, because if we don't get ahead of it, it's going to be the sharks biting at our toes. And we've been there. We've been in the sharks biting our toes. And so now we have to lift it up. The other thought I had, we talk about change, and one of the things where I think through this process of just the organization looking at our design and where we're going to be able to take that design to fulfill our strategic plan, is Peggy Garrity came on to support us in the communications plan around the redesign work. And one thing that she said that really, really stuck with me is, change is not a one and done event. Mm-hmm. And this is where my view of change, I think that really kind of stuck with me, that in my mind, change is every day. Change is every day. Change to me is exciting. It's what's next, where are we going next, what's happening. But I think too often people look at change as the one and done event. And it's almost like, okay, we have a new org structure. Let's let the dust settle for 6 months. I'll be okay. And then we'll just continue on. And sometimes it's continue on as we were before. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's continue on in a new way. And so part of the conversation that I think we need to continue having at NorQuest, and I would say in our community, in our businesses, is that change isn't one and done. This is our reality. And that's where I love the word agility, because I think you're going to be bumped, you're going to be prodded, you're going to sail for a little bit, and then you're going to hit a big rock. And so it's a new skill, I think, for employees. I think, we see even in the world of work, you don't see many people stay in jobs for 20, 30 years because everything is shifting and moving. So part of what I hope as we do our leadership transitions, as we continue to move forward on our strategic plan, is we also build that capacity and skill in people to be agile and to understand what that is, and to see it as exciting and positive versus, oh, here they go again. They're shifting the ground underneath me.
So with that, what does agility mean to you? Like, because I could kind of see this conversation because I know Jody so well. You kind of go, hey, I got this idea, agility and all this other stuff. But I'm quite sure there's a very tempered approach you took to sort of get that understanding of agility, what you're trying to, because sometimes words have different meanings for different people. So how did you present to Jody and the team, like, agility? What did that mean?
Well, I think we came through that a few different passes in a few different ways, but if I could characterize it today, it would be around having that confidence, the ability to move and pivot as needed, to take on different challenges as they come within an organization, and to really embrace that competency and that capability, and to work at that ability in skills, in approach, in mindset, and embrace that across the organization, to be able to embrace change, to be able to look for opportunity, and to build that confidence that there is this resilience within individuals, with resilience within the organization, to take those and keep expanding them and keep growing them and taking them on over time.
Because this really sounds like Mission Command to me. Like, I'm very excited about this because, shared understanding, acceptance of risk, right? Prudent initiative, like letting people get on with what they need to do. I mean, it is the very nature of Mission Command. It's very exciting. I'm glad I could be a consultant with you. We'll call it Mission Command stuff. But really, that's what you're describing is like, that's how we, if I can't go and tell a young officer, this is exactly what you're going to do in this situation. I just say to them, listen, this is what we're trying to do. I need you to get there, and as Jody put it, and this is where you can go. If you go outside that, you got to come back to me. But in the meantime, get there. That to me was the agility part of that conversation. So I could give that young leader the ability to know that the chain of command is going to support them. They're able to maneuver in that space to do what they have to do. They understand their boundaries. They understand when they can take risk and what risk they're not allowed to take because that's been articulated a bit. Everybody's got a shared understanding of what the goals and objective, and everybody understands, what I want to happen at the end. And I find this really fascinating that this is a great example. It happens all the time in our thing. We use a completely different set of words in business and the military, but we're saying the exact same thing. It's to get that agility, is that everybody understands where we're going and has the confidence that everybody's going to support them and achieve those goals. That's a cultural change in itself. And I'd like to say from my experience at college, I always thought the college had that quite well. There was, they were able to adapt the stuff that you guys do here. Every time I come, like, you guys doing this is incredible. But I find this fascinating that this is the language that we're talking. Well, I'll give you a book on Mission Command after this.
So
absolutely.
I think it's interesting because you said, how will a leader support you as an employee, as a soldier, in getting to where we need to get to? And this also is, I think, interesting in the work that Andrea does around leadership transitions, because I see it as, okay, you're making a big shift in your organization in terms of, one, what the roles are, two, how we'll work, and three, who's in those roles. So we'll have new people in roles. We'll have people in moving from one role to a very different role. And so in that, it's how do we support people when they move into new roles? And for example, Jill Matthew was our Chief Financial Officer. She's moving into the role of Chief Customer Experience Officer. And how is it going to be that everyone looks at Jill in the organization as, well, she's our finance officer? So imagine where you've got someone like Jill, who's a phenomenal leader, who has a very strong finance background. How do we support her in transitioning her into a new role and having the organization understand the context of a new person coming into corporate services and finance, and seeing Jill in this new role?
Yeah, absolutely. And those questions are fundamental to transition. And what I am wanting to underscore in your remarks is that dual duty. So of the leader themselves being able to articulate what's needed, or where there may be some blind spots or gap areas that they want to fill in or learn. And then also the receiving teams to understand how they can support that incoming leader into those roles, and being very clear about those changes and where they may need additional information or where they may need support in their role as well. So it's that dual relationship when you have people moving, the receiving teams as well as the leaders themselves.
Mm-hmm. And you have, Jeff, in the Canadian Forces, for example, you were Lieutenant Colonel in charge of the reserves, and you do that for a period of time, and then you move.
Yeah.
So what's the transition service that happens for you?
Okay, this won't sound good. So just to cover, I used to be a commanding officer of one of the reserve regiments here in town. So that was a fully engaged leading soldiers and everything else. And what we know is that when you finish that job, it's a fixed time. You go to do other jobs, and I'm not as busy as I was before, and that was probably the hardest transition for me to understand that. But I've since redug into the job I do now. Is I'm an advisor to our training command that does all of our planning, how we do our individual training and our training when we all get together. And I'm a reserve advisor to them to sort of help them with their planning because of the differences. So the transition for us is, my boss sort of said to me, hey, listen, you just got to understand that you're at the top of one hill and then you're actually climbing a different hill. It's not the same hill you're on before, because we don't go necessarily from a command of an operator, like a couple hundred soldiers to command of a couple thousand soldiers. You do stuff in between. So for us, that's pretty challenging. And I have to know, as a reserve officer, it's been very hard because I went from working just about every weekend to not working very many weekends. So my wife's happy about that to some degrees, but I found it very difficult to do that transition myself. And
I think, so to me it sounds like, and it may not be the case, but the transition was up to you more than anything. And so, and I think most organizations do that. I don't think it's unusual. I think it's, someone moves positions, okay, go. Do what you need to do, but there's not a planful transition, and I think that's well what's said. Interesting.
Yeah. No, that's a good way
in terms of what we're doing now, and we've never had a really good transition process. It's like, great, you're in this new job. Good luck. I hope it works.
No, that's a really good point, because I know that I just got on the last week. I was talking to a fellow who's going to a like job, and I said, hey, listen, the first thing you have to acknowledge is everything is going to be different. You're not going to be seeing soldiers. You're not leading soldiers. You're worrying about a policy, or you're worrying about some type of administration or something, because that's your transition. Like, just get your head around that, and everything will be easy after that. So if someone had said that to me, if I had realized the giant step that I took, that was so emotionally different for me. So just I'm not going to transition, because what I find really interesting is how you got into this. Like, what got you in your experience, you as an entrepreneur? How did you get from, as you said, hard working on the farm kind of approach to doing something like this? I'd be just very curious to your career pathway that got you to be able to be an advisor on this type of stuff.
Well, thank you for that question. Deeply motivating question for me. I really, my business partner and I had parallel but quite different careers, and had observed a common experience, which is when executives change roles or there's a change in leadership, that despite, really great organizations, great intentions, these things sometimes don't go so well. And we have really sophisticated operations, and we have really, excellent outcomes. But in that space of changing people in roles, that there'd be delays, or, they'd lose track to the strategy or lose momentum. And that just seemed to not make a lot of sense. So we dug in and investigated that problem, and found that lots of people are talking about it and validating that that's the case. There's actually a 40% failure rate among senior executive transitions. And that's consistent over time and jurisdiction. That's well researched. Some people will say 30%, some people will say 60%, which just seems like, why are we allowing that much, collateral damage to people as well as to organizations? And so our philosophy really is that this is a complex human system. People move into roles. There are predictable things that happen that can make it easier or harder. So, for example, in your story, when you talked about if somebody had told me about this kind of phenomenon of how I would feel when I left this type of role and went into this kind of role, then I would have had a different sense of that. And so that's very much about what we do, is that we know that when you repeat this across organization after organization after organization, there are patterns. And so there are ways of making that pattern of executive transition go super well and leadership transition across an organization, and make it go really well and maintain that momentum and not have those kind of misfires or miss hits, but instead really, seize those opportunities and keep building as opposed to missing them. And the next question you might have is like, why have we done that?
Yeah.
And I think that it comes down to a little bit of, people are really talented and accomplished, and we hire great people into great roles, and then we hand them the keys and give them a desk and then say, off you go. And so transition is really being about mindful about what are those, things that we can anticipate in advance, that we can plan for, being mindful about that, providing information at the right time, and upping, communication and information among teams, because it is such an intensive time around transitions, and we tend to rely on regular business to get that done, when in fact, in a really dynamic situation where you have lots of moves, that it calls for a different playbook.
So do you do a system analysis of the processes within an organization to see whether there's duplication or multi-layers to the processes? Do you do that as part of your role?
We're certainly mindful of those kinds of questions, but we wouldn't necessarily go that deep into the organization at that level.
So it's like a layer slice of the pyramid, if you will. You take up a slice of that and you look at that part of it.
Yeah,
assume like all the financial stuff is sound, and all the the stuff that you do, the regulatory process is all sound, and everything else. So you're taking that leadership structure, and that's what you're looking at.
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's interesting, Andrea, in terms of what you say. You can have all the best intentions. You can think you have the right plan, and I think of years ago in my career, moving from a vice president into really a leadership role as an executive director running an organization. And I always remember this day going, very exciting, new job, new office, great people. And I got to my office and there was 8 binders on the table. It was like, good luck. And that's what the transition was. And it was like, you wonder why people have imposter syndrome, because you walk in to the office and you're like, I have no freaking clue, right?
Yeah.
Because you think, well, I knew what to do to get here, and I knew all of that, but now I'm in a brand new field, brand new organization. I don't know who my go-to people are. I don't know who I can, who's going to be, my right hand to say I'm missing this information. Oh, but go ahead, look through binder 54 on page 38. Maybe you'll find the answer. And it's a horrifying, horrifying place to be, especially when you're the one totally accountable for everything.
Yeah. And well, also, that experience is further exacerbated because there's this tendency for all of us to think when we entered the organization is the same experience that the next person has. Yeah. And that frame of reference of how you experienced the entry into the organization or a move is what another person encounters. And so it's so specific to that particular time, what's happening, what's on deck, who's in the mix, all of the things that are moving. And it's developing that awareness around, it's important to understand the context of that moment when those moves are happening.
Because I think that's spot on. Like for my civilian job, as a reservist, I have a civilian job. We just had that discussion with our head office that you can't expect my replacement, because I'm going to a different job, to come in and be an instant transition. And we'll do it. We made the analogy: we can't build a plane in flight. We can't run the business and at the same time do a transition. So they finally agreed to a 2-week transition period. So that to me is very critical, and I think that's one of those things from a leadership. Bring it back down to leadership. That you as the leader, you have to look downwards and look at your subordinates and ensure that they have, you build a business case or a business model that allows you to have a transition period. And I think you probably do that in your transition piece to say, we're not going to play everybody change one seat to the left and start work the next, 15 minutes later. Clearly that's not going to work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes people are so either looking forward to where they're going or running away from where they've been. They're happy to go, thank God that's over. I'm in the new job. And then the poor person coming in is like, yeah, well, thanks a lot. You're my team player, aren't you? Right? I wonder, Andrea, I mean, the work that you're doing with us at NorQuest is leadership transition. And, you're working with core positions in the organization. If you take that deep into the organization where you have the first-time manager, so you're doing really, really well in your job and you get promoted into the next level, and now you're the manager and you have certain accountabilities. If you could give advice to supervisors, to people moving into new roles, what would be maybe 2 or 3 things that you would say? Because one of the things I'm always mindful of, and it's certainly something Jeff and I talk about, is how do we support that movement, skill development, making sure people land well? What advice would you give?
Yeah, a few things is right off the top is for everyone to be transparent that it's a period of change and transition, and recognize that as, the receiving team or the person moving, that, it's uncomfortable, it's challenging, and humor is a great place to start, is to, enjoy the fact that takes you out of your comfort zone as much as you can. Ask for help, ask the dumb questions. I would say also as a career practice, this doesn't have to be exhaustive. It just could be just something simple you keep track of kind of week to week or month to month. Is think about, if you were to leave your role for whatever reason, what would the next person need? And if you just get into the habit of thinking about what's necessary to do a great job in that role, it'll help you build forward into the next one. So that could be just having a folder on your desktop where you think, oh gosh, that's a good piece of information for the next person in this seat. Or alternatively, when I move forward, I'll want to be thinking about that too. And then the other one is that, for those folks who have people that are joining their teams, is to think about, what does welcome look like? Have a thoughtful plan around those pieces. Sometimes if you're receiving somebody from outside, just what's in the area that you go to. How do people get together and talk? It's those things among people, of how you come together as a group, that's so helpful in making people feel comfortable and ready to take on their roles. So just a few things to pop into the mix.
What's interesting is everything you've said is quite simple.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And so to me, it doesn't
reasonable.
have to be
just
onerous.
Think about it,
It's just really taking a breath and saying, what do I need to do? Or if, let's say, I end up being off sick for 2 weeks or a month, or I get hit by a bus, or I win the lottery, you want to make sure the next person coming in can be successful, versus taking the attitude, well, it's not my problem, right? It's really taking accountability, and proud accountability, not that it's an extra thing you have to do.
Yeah,
and that's something we do in the military. Like when we're training, we always say to the you have to understand the job 2 levels up, because in combat, you might have to work. You have to understand what they're doing 2 levels up. So you have to understand that, because you might actually have to do that job. And even, I had a boss who was really great, who said to me, I'm going to train you to do my job because I'm replaceable. I want you to replace me, and someone needs to replace you. So you make sure you've got a person who can step up. So if something happens, we can all step up seamlessly. We all know how things work. We're all read in. We're all familiar with the stuff. And I always thought that was great advice for an organization. If you have that sort of view that, it's not you're replaceable, we can get rid of you at any moment. It's you need to be able to replace your boss, and someone in your organization needs to be able to replace you. So if you're sick or something happens or an operational deployment comes up and someone's not there, the system just carries on, and it's not a great burden institutionally to be able to do that.
Yeah, and it's getting outside of thinking of just yourself inside your role, but understanding that you're part of a connected system, and how do you help that connected system do well within that seat, but also who might be in that seat next.
Well, I think it's always been a foundational leadership. You as a leader, you got to be thinking about the team and everybody in it, and not just yourself. If you're just viewing it from your lens, you're not necessarily doing a good job. That welcoming piece for all the people who are going to be the new subordinates, everything else, you got to work with them too, get them familiar with the change, because for them, you alone might be the change factor that they're experiencing. So you need to manage how you relate to them, because you can cause as much, this is the wrong type of disruption, but the bad type of disruption to the system, simply because of your change in style if you don't temper it. Like for us in the military, we always tell people, you take over a new position, you spend 2 months just listening, watching, and you say, when I took command of my regiment, I said, all processes, orders, directives remain in effect. So there was no change from my arrival. We were carrying on so that I could learn as a leader about what my processes were and how I did things. I didn't want to make any premature direction or order without understanding what it was. And that's a tradition for an American unit that I was in. They always said that when they handed over. And I thought that was a really good thing to do, to say, I have complete confidence of where we're at. I need to understand this, because even my change brings disruption to the system. And we need to understand that as leaders. And I think that's a great takeaway from a leader point of view.
So, Jeff, on day 61, did you blow things up?
No, I didn't. That was pretty
Very good.
I did some change. But
Very good. So I think we're coming to the end of our time.
I just have one question.
Sure.
In the new processes, are nap rooms going to be part of NorQuest College? Because I know people have called me and they've asked me this question to ask, will there be naps during, because that's the new thing, and I just want to say, can they take nap during work time? See, Corey agrees with me too. That's one of his questions. So is that rumor true or false? So I'll leave that to Jody.
So what I would say is that our employees will need to have good health and wellness.
Good health and wellness. Good
health and wellness. And we have really, really semi-comfortable sofas throughout the college. And I think when we actually built the Sigmar Center, one of the challenges of the level of comfort is we had to have fire retardancy. So you could probably do maybe a 10-minute nap to make it work.
That's disruptive.
And now I know why you come 40 minutes early every time, because you're sleeping on the couch. So thank you very, very much, Andrea and Jeff. I think it was a great conversation.
I really enjoyed this. I find it fascinating. And I will get you a mission command book, because I think you could find, depending on your audience, I think you could find some of this, because what we've found is when we talk about, we've done combined presentations on leadership, that a certain word, certain people gravitate to it, and certain words I would use, certain people gravitate, and combined, we got the message across very clearly. So I'll get you a good book on mission command.
And I'll read it.
Thank you very much, everyone.
You've been listening to Leadership in Challenging Times with Dr. Jody Abbott and Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson on the NorQuest College podcast. Any questions or suggestions on any episodes can be directed to us at podcast@norquest.ca. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please remember to subscribe using iTunes or Google Play and get updated when the new episodes become available. Thanks for listening.